Thank you so much, and may I just say that it's a great and wonderful pleasure to be here. And I did sort of change the title as I was fiddling around with the slides, and so that's why it took a moment. So the question that motivates this work is the question of how it is that humans and other social animals seem to care not just about themselves, but about others, and how it can be that they are motivated to cooperate, to sometimes incur a cost to themselves in order to produce a benefit to someone else. The book in which I explore this is a book that came out of Princeton University Press called Brain Trust. That's enough advertising. Now, one way within neuroscience that we tend to think about value is value in its deepest sense is expressed by that organization in the nervous system that ensures that the animal survives. So there is circuitry in all animals, including humans, but let's for a moment just think about pre-mammals. There is circuitry so that the animal, if it's feeling pain, is motivated to correct that, or if it is cold, or if it is hungry, or if it is thirsty, or if it feels, I guess, lusty. It is motivated to do something. And homeostasis, that is the maintenance of the inner milieu of the body, is the name, of course, that we give to that. And homeostasis has been really quite well explored by physiologists, and although we don't know everything about it, we know quite a lot about it. And homeostasis is actually very consistent with what we know also about biological evolution. That is to say that it is competitive, that if there were an animal that had circuitry that was consistent with self-neglect, it wouldn't last very long. Somebody else would have it for lunch. And so one of the big questions I think that has troubled at least some biologists, and we know Ed Wilson, for example, at Harvard worried a lot about this, and in this quote we see Richard Dawkins worrying also, and that is that somehow this self-oriented care is so fundamental and so pervasive that it makes any argument or any analysis of how it might be that an organism can care about another out of the biological realm. And so in this quote, Dawkins says that don't look to biology if you want to understand how it is that an organism can exhibit other care or can exhibit generosity or cooperation. And I think that that is a very common view, but interestingly, it was not Darwin's view. Darwin says in The Descent of Man that our moral sense or our conscience depends essentially on three things. On social instincts, by which he means something that is profoundly part of us and not just acquired. But it also depends on something that is acquired, and that is habits. Habits learned within a social context. And finally, he says it depends also, at least in the case of organisms such as ourselves, on reason, which we might these days think of more generally in terms of problem solving. And now with the developments in neuroscience, but also in ethology, animal studies, I think we can see that Darwin was fundamentally right. And part of what I want to tell you about tonight are those developments and how I think that they are important as we think about the nature of morality itself. I want to make a couple of sort of preliminary background points just to sort of have them on the table. And the first one involves reminding ourselves about other species of humans and the fact that we diverged from chimpanzees, that is humans did, about 5 million years ago. So in this diagram, we have time on the vertical axis, age in million years, and spatial extent on the horizontal axis. And what I think is very interesting, of course, about this is that there are some guys, like Homo erectus, who are around for a very long time. And Homo neanderthalis, also around for quite a long time. And Homo neanderthalis is very interesting because, for a couple of reasons. One was they had very large brains, somewhat larger than humans. And they seem also to have had the vocal apparatus such that they could have had at least some of the same sounds that we have. And so it's very much still an open question whether they had some linguistic facility. Probably all of these humans were very much like humans in many crucial respects. That is, they were upright and they tended to live in groups. But just to give you a bit of a feel for the differences, Homo erectus had a brain size of about 800 cc's, maybe 1,000. Yours is probably somewhere between 13 and 1,500 cc's. So yours is larger, but not massively larger. They had the use of fire, and notice that they got themselves a long way out of Africa, into Asia, and so forth. How did they do that? Well, they appeared to have, with their little brains, they appear to have made rafts. So it's very interesting that although they died out, they seem to have been very successful for a very long time. Now, I want to make just a couple of other points here. And one is that Homo sapiens, us guys, have been around somewhere between 200,000 and maybe 300,000 years. It's a wonderfully interesting puzzle that it wasn't until about 40,000 years ago that we started to do things like paint on caves. It wasn't until about 100,000 years ago that we did things like decorate bodies with cowrie shells and red ochre and so forth. And for more than 100,000 years, with essentially the same brain you have, they used only stone tools. They didn't even tie a stone axe to a pole and make a hatchet. They didn't even make spears. Now, this is a sobering thought when we think about how smart we are, that it took humans many tens of thousands of years to move from a hand axe to a spear. All right. Probably the kind of social organization that Homo erectus had or that Homo sapiens had in those early years was fairly simple. Even though at birth, your brain and the brain of one of them would be virtually indistinguishable. There have, of course, been some evolutionary changes in Homo sapiens over the last 200,000 years, but so far as we know, mostly they have been limited to fairly simple things that don't involve a lot of brain reorganization. They're simple things like digestive enzymes for milk, for example. So probably they didn't have anything like organized religion, and so the social norms that they had were probably not all that different from the kinds of social norms that we saw in hunter-gatherer groups before, of course, they were, as it were, westernized. So the Inuit, for example, that were studied by Franz Boas in the 19th century, had social norms and practices that were not articulated, but people understood by example what they were and lived by them. So these things are important to keep in mind, lest we imagine that our own particular style of thinking about morality here and now must actually be true all the way back. Probably not. Now, there is a second point that I want to make here, partly because I think that it challenges certain sort of long-standing assumptions about philosophical methodology. Most of the concepts and the categories that we have and that we use in an everyday way, the concept of food, of mountain, of river, of vehicle, of chair, of house. Most of these concepts have a radial structure. And this was discovered by Eleanor Rosch in the 1960s. And what that means is that there are prototypical examples at the center, which we all agree, or pretty much everybody agrees, are instances of the type. Out at the edge are very fuzzy boundaries. And in between, with declining similarity to the prototypes, are everything else. And so if you ask an undergraduate class, what's the first vegetable that comes to your mind? About 90% of the students will say carrot. And carrots are indeed, at least in the West, are prototypical vegetables. And what about radishes? Well, they're not prototypical, they're sort of out here somewhere. Some people don't consider them vegetables at all, they're just garnishes, who would eat such a thing, and so forth. And then, of course, even further out on the fuzzy boundary are something like wild mushrooms, chanterelles in this particular case. Now, there is no answer to the question, but are chanterelles really mushrooms? I mean, really vegetables? It doesn't really matter. We get along very well with a concept of vegetable that has this radial structure, and mostly none of us find it very fruitful to argue about whether parsley really is a vegetable, whether wild mushrooms really are vegetables, and so forth. Now, this is important because it suggests that sometimes arguments about concepts that philosophers care about, are really arguments about whether parsley is really a vegetable. Now, the other thing I want to say about that's interesting, I think, about this discovery of Rosch's, and as I'm sure you know, George Lakoff then went on to do a ton of experimental work, which essentially verified what she had found. So the concept of house is what constitutes a prototype varies as a function of culture. So in Texas, that's a house. In the Arctic, that's the prototypical house. On the prairies in about 1920, that was a prototypical house, and so on and so forth. So there's cultural variability as to what counts as a prototype. And where am I going with this? Well, I think social categories also have a radial structure. There are prototypes, fuzzy boundaries, and stuff in between. And when children learn what it is to be a friend, what it is to be honest, kind, brave, or trustworthy, or indeed what it is to be moral or not moral, what they are doing is acquiring radial concepts. And just as an aside, the interesting thing about this is that it comports so well with how we think neural networks learn. And so it has that added interest. Now, I'm not going to say that's a result, but it is an interesting thing that artificial neural networks have prototypical fuzzy boundary and in-between structure as well. So the main point then that I want to make here is that at some point, someone is going to say, but how do you define moral? Or how do you define what it is to be honest? Or what it is to be kind? And my answer is going to be, these are radial categories. And you and I will agree almost certainly on the prototypes. And we're probably going to disagree about things in the boundary. If we're both on a jury and we have to make a decision, then we have to make a decision about the boundary cases. But often we can just let them be. Now, I want to talk a little bit about biological aspects of sociality and what we are learning about social behavior and how I think that it helps us understand something about what makes us moral. Sociality, like color vision, almost certainly evolved many times. And so in this slide, you'll see discus fish, a pair of discus fish, and if you look carefully, you'll see the babies who are feeding off their skin, which exudes a kind of mucus that's full of nutrients for the baby. And of course, as you know, bees are highly social insects with highly stereotypical behavior. Termites, of course, are another example, as are ants. Now, I think it had been thought, maybe, for example, by Ed Wilson, that the sociality at these levels might actually inform us about sociality of mammalian species. My guess is that it doesn't really, that what we're looking at in the case of mammals is so much more sophisticated, so much more complex, and it looks like it depends on very different kinds of circuitry, which means it depends on very different genes. But then there can be some convergence as well, as for example, there is in color vision. So that the opsins and rhodopsin are found, seem to have evolved independently in many different species to aid in vision. So why did mammals come to be at all, is the question I want to ask. We think that some 200 or so million years ago, proto-mammals that were warm-blooded emerged. And the fact that they were homeotherms and able to keep themselves at an appropriate temperature, no matter what the outside, was a tremendous advantage. What it meant was that they could hunt at night when all of the other lizards were lying around snoozing, waiting for the sun to come up. So they could forage without fear, and they might even forage on some of those snoozing lizards. It also meant that they could venture into colder climates and do very well. Now, the interesting thing about homeotherms is that it takes a lot of energy to keep yourself warm. So sort of gram for gram, a homeotherm needs about 10 times the energy of a cold-blooded animal, which is why you can go away for a week and leave your lizard with just a few flies, but you couldn't possibly do that with a cat or a dog. So there's a huge energy investment. And part of what changed then was that in order to have all of that, you have to have a much bigger foraging patch. So in this particular slide, you can see that all these lizards can live pretty happily together because they don't actually eat very much. But how about a fox? All right, a fox is going to have to eat a lot every day just to keep itself going. And that means there can only be a few foxes in that territory. And so when things get close, you have to leave, find new territory, and so forth. Well, what does that entail about the development of the mammalian brain? Well, several things, and we don't really understand the order of all of these things, but it means that it pays to be smart. So it's a really good idea, if you're a mammal, to be able to learn in a new environment what's going on, what's prey, how to do it, how to get it. All right, so how do you get smart? Suppose I'm Mother Nature, and I want to make an animal smart. I could either build it into the genes so that the genes express in the brain so that the brain is ready for every contingency. Not a good strategy because dickering around with the genes, even for Mother Nature, is going to take a lot of time. And moreover, you're going to have a really huge brain, most of which is not very useful because those contingencies never arise. A very smart way of doing it is making the animal able to learn, giving it the flexibility so that no matter what environment they're in, they can tune the brain up to that environment. And that's the amazing thing, actually, that mammals do. So a major thing that happened in mammalian brain evolution is that we got this thing called cortex. Now, what exactly is cortex, and what exactly is it that we have that, say, a lizard or a toad does not have? Well, a lizard, for example, has many of the structures, the deep structures that we have, like a brainstem and a hypothalamus, but it has kind of this sort of loosey thing on top, which people call a dorsal cortex. But true cortex, or what sometimes we call neocortex, looks like this. So what you're looking at here is a slice of human brain cut this way, all right? And what the cortex is just this outer rind that goes along here. It's stained purple in this case, but if you're actually looking at a real brain, it looks rather gray, which is why it's called gray matter. And it really consists mostly, as you can see over here, of cell bodies, whereas the white stuff has very few cell bodies and consists of long fibers going from the cell bodies elsewhere. Well, what's so great about cortex? We're not entirely sure how it is that it makes us smart, but the interesting thing about cortex, and that what makes it different from any other neural structure that we have in the brain, is that it has this leveled laminar structure, approximately 6 levels depending on exactly how you like to count. And it's highly organized so that every layer has a precise feed in and a precise feed out to where it goes. Different layers send stuff to different places, and different layers get stuff from different places. And cortex is pretty much, to a first approximation, pretty much the same everywhere. And the interesting thing about cortex is it seems that the genes that turn off and turn on the progenitor cells can just say, I think I'll just wait and we'll make more cortex. And you get more, and you get more, and you can just get more. So it turns out that, of course, rodents, I guess I'm not supposed to wander, that rodents have cortex. In fact, we don't have any structures in our brain that a rat does not have. It's all the same stuff. We just have a lot more. And in particular, we have a lot more cortex. Now, one of the great outstanding questions in neuroscience for which we really do not have an answer is, how is it that you get a qualitative difference out of more? How is it that just a lot more gives you something very different, such as the capacity to use language? How is it that cortex makes you smart? Because it's not that lizards, of course, are dumb. It's just that their structures are so much less flexible because they are dominated by genetic control, because they don't learn in the way cortex does. So the big trade-off when you are Mother Nature making mammals is that you want to increase the learning capacity. But that means you've got to do the compensatory thing, which is the newborns have to be able to have their brains tuned up to wherever they find themselves, so the newborns have to be dependent. So there's the big trade-off. You're going to be smart, but you're real dumb at first. Turtles, of course, can crawl out of their eggs and off they go. No rodent baby does that. No human baby does that. Now, I like this slide because it's a nice characterization of a bit of cortex shown, this is from a human, shown at 1 month. And what you'll see is that there are quite a number of neurons there, but they are sparsely branched, whereas by 4 years, you see that the density has increased enormously. And it will continue to increase until puberty. The brain grows by about 50% from birth to then. And interestingly, at puberty in humans, but we don't actually see this in rats, is that there is a pruning back. And the pruning back seems to make us much more efficient in ways that we don't understand. So there's another wonderful, outstanding question in neuroscience. But this slide is nice because it shows you that in getting Cortex, where Cortex was designed to be very immature at birth so that the critter could tune its brain up to its environment, whatever it happened to be, was a very, very interesting strategy. So just to kind of sum up this part of the talk, so what we see is that homeothermy is closely linked to the development of laminar cortex, because you need to be smart in order to keep all that warmth going. The other thing I should mention, of course, too, oh, I'm wandering again. The other thing I should mention is that getting bigger brains also has a cost, just as homeothermy does. So that in our own case, the estimates go roughly like this, that your brain is about 2% of your body mass, but it uses about 20% of your energy. Brains are energy hogs. So there's a limit on how big you want your brain to be. So that's also an interesting sort of constraint. But the bigger the brain, in a way, the smarter you have to be in order to feed that big brain. All right, so we also then have this connection to infant dependence and to parent care. I'm not going to say anything about the placenta, even though the placenta is a very cool thing. So infant dependence means that what Mother Nature has to do then is, if the infant can't do very much to feed itself, flee from danger, and so forth, it has to ensure that it's cared for. And the only person around, of course, is the mom. So part of what happened in the evolution of the mammalian brain is that it was reorganized to do something completely different. And that is that whereas a mother lizard would see to her own food and safety and warmth, a mother rat sees both to her own food and safety and warmth, but also to the other, to the infants, almost as though it was her own. So it's as though the brain kind of extends homeostasis to include in its ambit the baby. And that is the big evolutionary change. That's the big genetic change that we're beginning to understand in the mammalian brain. And so what I want to suggest is that it's this change that Darwin was really sensitive to when he realized that it's a very natural thing for social animals, for mammals, to have care, in particular to have care for the offspring. But of course, offspring are only part of the story. And so what we also want to know in the case of social animals, and I don't just mean us, I mean also baboons and elephants and dolphins and chimpanzees and so forth, we want to know how is it that we care about friends, about mates, and sometimes even about strangers. And in this slide, this is the question, is what is the underlying biology that takes it from me to kin, that is offspring, to kith, friends and others in the group. And up here you'll see a pair of marmosets and a pair of baboons down here. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the underlying biology. This is probably a story that some of you will know, but I'll go through it quickly, and it's one of my favorite stories. So there are many species of voles. Voles are little rodents, and voles are very similar in most respects, but in their social life, there are some interesting differences. In particular, prairie voles and montane voles do have a very different social life. So montane voles are pretty much what you would expect. Montane voles live in the mountains. And montane voles, the male and the female come together, they meet, they mate, and they go on their merry way. And she has babies, she takes care of them for a short while, and then they go on and become adult montane voles. Prairie voles are very different. They come together, they meet, they mate, they bond for life. There is some change that happens at that first mating such that they stay together for life. Are you okay? Okay. If you have to go, it's all right. Now, what do I mean by they bond for life? I mean that they like each other's company, they like to stay with each other, that the male helps rear the pups, which is never seen in montane voles. The male also guards the nest against intruders and against other predators. And it doesn't mean that there is sexual exclusivity, because sometimes the male will mate with another, but by and large, most of the offspring happen with the mated female. So the question has to be asked: what's the difference in the brains between the montane voles and the prairie voles, such that we see this strong bonding? And incidentally, in the case of the prairie voles, if one of the mates die, the other one is depressed. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you throw it into a bucket of water, it just kind of goes, you know, like it's hardly worth living. Whereas normally, of course, they'll scurry about trying to get out. And there's also differences in feeding behavior that get associated with being depressed. So what's the difference in the brain? So this was the question asked by Sue Carter, who's shown here, also by Larry Young and several others. Now, the story can get quite complex, but I just want to give you the simple part of the story. So what you're looking at here are slices of male vole brain. Now, in addition to the many hormones that are coursing through the brain of the female and the male, stress hormones, testosterone, and other things, there's oxytocin and there's also vasopressin. And these turn out to be proteins that are absolutely crucial in the story of care of offspring and also mate attachment. Now, there's other things that are involved too, but I'm going to focus on these for a moment. Oxytocin and vasopressin are very similar peptides. They differ only in two places, and they can sometimes bind to one another's receptors. So what you're going to look at here, OT means oxytocin, and then V1 means vasopressin. R stands for receptor. So any hormone or neurotransmitter in the brain can only have an effect if it binds to a neuron and changes something about that neuron so that the neuron responds in a different way. So there have to be receptors. So basically what was found, now this is going to be the brain of the montane vole, and this is the brain of the prairie vole. Similarly here, this is the brain of the prairie vole. What you're going to be looking at here are oxytocin receptors. And what you notice is the density of receptors in the prairie vole in one specific area, part of the reward system, interestingly, in the nucleus accumbens. The density of receptors is much greater in the prairie vole than the montane vole. For vasopressin, it's in a different area, the ventral pallidum, also part of the reward system, and there the density of receptors is much greater in the prairie vole than in the montane vole. So you have a correlation here, and it's an interesting question then, whether this reflects anything about the behavior. So as you can imagine, all the manipulations were done so that if you block the receptors for oxytocin in either male or female prairie voles, and you let them come together and mate, they do not form long-term attachments. So those receptors appear to play a very crucial role. Now we think there's other things that matter too, probably the endogenous opioids. But in any case, at least in voles, it looks like this is a really, really important part of the story. So this, in conjunction with other work that had been done on parent-offspring connections, suggests that there are small genetic changes that you can make that change things like receptor density, that change things in the behavioral domain, such as attachment and bonding. And attachment and bonding, of course, relate to care. So that if the mates care for one another, then the male will fight off intruders and so on, and he likes to be with her and she likes to be with him and so on and so forth. All right. So now in this slide, I really just kind of want to orient you to that part of the mammalian brain that is really important for the production of oxytocin. And I'm not showing vasopressin here, I'm only showing oxytocin, but it's in the hypothalamus, which is this tiny little area here, shown as blown up here, and there's two very tiny little areas that manufacture oxytocin and send it both into the pituitary, but also into the central nervous system. And so if you block oxytocin or if you block oxytocin receptors, you get interesting changes in social behavior. We also know from animal behavior studies that if you take rat pups, for example, who are normally with their mom and next to their mom, and they can smell her and she's licking them and they're suckling, and you take them out and separate them, but keep them warm and fed for 3 hours a day for a couple of weeks, and then bring them back. They do not socialize normally. And it may be that there is an interaction between the environment and the production of oxytocin receptors, but probably also some other neurotransmitters like serotonin are involved. Interestingly, those rat pups that were, so to speak, neglected, those rat pups tend not to tend their own offspring in the normal, typical fashion either. And so there's something not right about their social brains that interferes with typical maternal behavior. So in this slide, this really just shows the deep structures, the cortex, of course, on top, but the deep structures, some of which are part of the reward system and that play a really important role in social behavior. In this slide, I just kind of want to acknowledge, because there has been a certain amount of, shall we say, infatuation about oxytocin. And I just want to say that with regard to the mother and offspring, but probably it's also much more complicated with regard to mate attachment. There are many hormones involved, many neurotransmitters, and they can be interactive. So if you hear this claim that oxytocin is the moral molecule or the cuddle molecule, as is sometimes said, is a bit silly. Is really not so. But we do want to know, what is it actually that oxytocin does? Now, before I get to that, I'm just going to sort of sum up a little bit and say that the hypothesis so far that I'm interested in is this, that sociability seems to be a basic value for social mammals, and I should say a basic value for many species of bird. And you're going to wonder, do birds have oxytocin and vasopressin? And the answer is they have, at least those that have been looked at, have an analog, which is mesotocin. So it's very similar peptide, differing, I think, from oxytocin in one place. And interestingly, many more species of bird than species of mammal show long-term pair bonding. So the hub of the story, but only the hub, is oxytocin. And the reward system is extremely important. So even rats learn a lot about how to behave in the rat colony after they're born. It's not all reflex and instinct. And finally, that sociability gets elaborated with the expansion of cortex. And so by the time you get to big-brained mammals like chimpanzees and bonobos and baboons and humans, we're seeing social behavior that is much more complex than what we see in the case of a rodent. And just to sort of stop for a moment, these are marmosets, tiny little guys. They are long-term pair bonders. Interestingly, in the case of marmosets, they actually, the male takes more care or invests more time in the rearing of the young than does the female. And I had to put the ravens in because ravens are extremely interesting, very, very clever and intelligent. They are, of course, are long-term pair bonders. This is a meerkat. They live in groups, and they share the duty, the males do, of going out of the burrow and standing on guard looking for lions. And if he sees a lion, he makes all kinds of racket, and everybody dives down the hole. And I wanted to use this slide just also to remind us that, all right, these animals can be social, they can care about the others, they can cooperate, for example, as wolves cooperate. Nevertheless, there is still competition. It's not like it goes away. And so there are, within wolf packs or baboon troops, there are kind of norms or rules or social ways of doing things that try to keep disruptive and destabilizing competition at a minimum. And I imagine that early Homo sapiens probably operated in much the same way. So socialization involves tuning up the reward system and essentially growing a conscience. That is to say, so that certain things become second nature to you as things that you ought not do, impulses that you ought to control, and so forth. And although I won't have time to talk about it today, the reward system, the reinforcement learning system, is something about which we really knew very little until about the last 10 years. And slowly, much of the reward system is now coming into focus. And we're learning how incredibly sophisticated and complicated the reward system is in humans. Okay, so in humans, problem solving almost certainly, and we can see this in early hunter-gatherer societies such as the Inuit, we can see that their problem solving and the norms that they adopt are really very well suited to the kind of life that they need to live. And the norms that different groups adopt sometimes also have their roots in history, that things were done in a certain historical way, or there was a particular historical event that motivated something. But I think it's very likely that by and large in small groups, that norms are rarely sort of articulated, made explicit, and discussed. And we know this, for example, from the Inuit, where within group competition is really frowned upon, but it's never openly discussed. That's just what everybody knows, and the children pick it up in this sort of easy, unconscious way that we all pick up a lot of things. So that even us, even though we might have articulated for us the idea that we're not supposed to tell lies, many of us have rules or norms that we don't articulate and probably can't about how close is appropriate to stand to a stranger when you're having a discussion. And we know when it's too close, and we know when it's too far, And it's not something that we can precisely say. And for most of the things that early humans had as their basic social practices, they were probably much like that. However, with the advent of agriculture, almost certainly people began to live in larger groups. They didn't know everybody. It wasn't always possible to use moral suasion to get someone to change their behavior. And at that point, there may also have been new kinds of social problems where the need to articulate became useful. And it may also have been useful at about this time to invent the idea of gods. Gods that can see you even when I can't. So you may be off traveling to the neighborhood, the other village, and on your way, somebody will see you, not me and not any other farmer, but God. And so the idea of being watched by someone, I think, is a very natural idea, and one which probably has some genuine efficacious value. But now, as human life became more and more complex, clearly what humans were engaged in is exactly really what Aristotle described, and that was finding the kinds of social institutions that work reasonably well so that people who are living within those institutions enjoy well-being and prosperity. And it's always kind of, as Dewey, the American philosopher, said, it's always kind of an experiment when you are fashioning an institution, whether it's an institution involving banking and credit or an institution involving a system of contracts and obligations, or a system involving criminal justice. And we're always kind of changing and fine-tuning, and often the consequences we can't see until the institution is in place. And sometimes we regret the institutions we put in place, and we have to back up and start again. And I think in this way, Aristotle had a much deeper understanding about social life and morality and the importance of social institutions than, say, someone like Plato, who thought that, perhaps if you sort of reflect on things enough, the really deep truths of morality will emerge And for Aristotle, too, I think that the notion of judgment, and that often we are called upon to exercise judgment where there is no precise rule, and where, in fact, hewing out a precise rule would actually make things worse. I think it's a very deep and important idea. And it's one that's easy to lose sight of, because if you can't define judgment, and judgment is, after all, another one of those radial categories where good judgment, there's going to be lots of prototypes, and there's lots of prototypes for bad judgment, and in between, we sometimes don't know what to say. So there is, of course, a large cultural dimension to the story of morality. What I wanted to focus on in this talk really was the biological platform. That platform that arose out of the need for care of dependent offspring so that they could be smart and make a living in the world. That what arose out of that and then got extended then to mates and friends and so forth, that constitutes a kind of biological platform on which various institutions, then various structures can be built in order to get social structures that in some sense satisfy the Aristotelian desideratum. And with that, I'll close, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.